Let's dive into a fascinating watercolor technique that will help you add amazing depth and vibrancy to your painting. I'm talking about the so-called charging technique, and it's absolutely my favorite for botanical art. You can think of it as a variation on the wet on wet technique, and it's often referred to as mixing on paper. This technique involves introducing new pigments onto a partially dried wash whenever you want to intensify your colors, adjust the hues, or create lots of visual interest. It's like adding a touch of magic to your painting, and I'm going to use this orchid branch to demonstrate different case studies on different petals so you can learn about different scenarios where it can help you enhance your artwork, hopefully get inspired, and start using this technique in your own work. Before I start showing you exactly how it works, I'm going to put down some bright green underpainting on the petals. These sections will shine through the violet that I will apply in just a few minutes. As I'm working through the petals, I will remind you that you can download the reference photo and see my full list of watercolor materials in the video description below. As always, I will put the entire painting process on my Patreon so we can practice together in real time. By the way, I'm using green gold from Daniel Smith, but you can mix your own shade using green and yellow. And now the green sections are drying. I'm getting my pink colors ready, and we can start experimenting with the charging technique. The first and most common scenario is when you want to ever so slightly adjust the hue of an existing color wash, adding some vibrancy and lots of visual interest to a specific area of your painting. On these pink petals, I start by covering a segment with light opera pink, and then while my paper is still wet, I'm adding quinacridone magenta right in the middle of the petal. Using a gentle touch and a damp brush, I softly charge a very similar but slightly darker, more intense pink color into a drying wash to create a subtle blend. Notice that my magenta doesn't reach the edges of the petal, creating a very soft, light ring around the silhouette, just like the one I see in the real flower on my reference photo. On the background petals, I'm adding a little bit of purple to create a shadow effect. Timing is key with this technique. You want the existing wash to be slightly damp so it can still hold its shape, but wet enough for the new paint to meld beautifully into the background. Now let's do something different on the dark violet petals using the charging technique to create depth and dimension on the orchid. I will cover the petal with very diluted perylene violet at first. Wait a little bit longer than I did on the pink petals, so the surface is a little bit less wet. And then I will charge it with much more concentrated perylene violet around the edges, followed by splashes of magenta. What's happening here is two things. The darker violet helps me capture the shadows and texture on the petal, and magenta, which we just applied on the pink petals, helps me harmonize the overall palette, ensuring a cohesive and unified look throughout the painting. Magenta can be considered an analogous color to violet, so it doesn't look out of place, but it also echoes that vibrant pink on other petals, creating beautiful color continuity in this composition. You can experiment with dilution a lot here. As you can see, a softer touch on the pink petals created a more subtle blend, while bolder application on the violet petals using more saturated, more precise strokes resulted in more defined edges and color variations. In some areas, I'm bringing back my green gold and even introducing blue, charging them into my violet petals. You may recall from color theory that green and violet are considered complementary colors. They sit opposite each other on the color wheel, creating a very strong visual contrast. Blue, of course, is the coolest color on the spectrum and always comes in handy when we want to create shadows or make objects look like they're further away. So the charging technique allows me to place all these colors next to each other rather than blending them completely. And this part is very important because it shows the difference between a classic wet on wet technique and the charging technique we're working with here. I know many of you were thinking about these definitions from the start of the video because both methods involve working with wet paint and wet surface. The key difference between wet on wet and charging is timing and your desired effects. You can think of charging as a variation on the wet on wet technique, but the results are slightly different. Wet on wet technique creates more smooth, thorough blend and is commonly used with one pigment and clear water on background layers, while charging technique involves slightly drier surface and more than one pigment. It allows us to create better contrast and visual separation between the colors we're working with. Now I'm applying yet another layer of pink on the petals, charging now with more magenta and even some quinacridone red to give it some warmth. And I will say that for natural subjects like these flowers, where color transitions are very common with very soft natural edges, this variation on wet technique is essential. And if you love color play and introducing different hues, boosting the natural colors that you see in your reference, and taking everything into a more hyper-realistic territory, you should definitely give it a try. I will finish the painting by applying some dioxazine purple on the branch and adding more saturated pink veins on the petals. Now working wet on dry, meaning applying paint to a completely dry surface and glazing my finishing touches very lightly throughout. There's a little bit of white space at the bottom of the page, so I may add an insect of some sort, maybe a butterfly, but I need to ask for your help now. If you know what orchid species I just painted, please let me know in comments below. I found the reference photo on Unsplash, but it didn't mention the name, and I would love to know what type of orchid this is so I can name the painting properly. I know there's some of you watching who are absolute experts in this area, and you always help me with identifying bird anatomy and flower species, so thank you very much for your help. And my final piece of advice, if you like the charging technique and you want to try it in your own work, is to always test on scrap paper and play around with different timing and different pigments to understand how they behave and what works better for your style. Remember that practice is key, so embrace the unexpected outcomes. Sometimes charging leads to very delightful surprises, enhancing your painting in unforeseen ways. Have fun exploring this technique in your watercolor journey. Don't forget to subscribe for more watercolor magic and share your charged watercolor artworks with me if you are on Instagram or my Patreon Facebook group. Don't forget that I have a free watercolor workshop on my YouTube channel where I show you step by step in real time how to paint another pink orchid. I also provide outlines and references in that video. You can access it at any time, and I will leave a link in the video description below. Until next time, thank you for watching and painting with me.